Roger and Sarah Bansemer visit Hulett, Wyoming on the next episode of Painting and Travel. Sarah talks with artist Bob Coronato about how etchings are made, and Roger uses acrylics to paint a typical Western saloon lantern.
Hello, welcome to Hulett, Wyoming. Population 363 people. We were driving through here and we had to stop because we love the looks of this gallery owned by an artist, Bob Coronato. I'll take you inside and we'll have a chance to hear some interesting facts from him. I want to introduce you to Bob Coronato. He's an artist. We're standing in his studio, and this is his etching press. Now, Roger and I had a chance to walk around his gallery, and we're so impressed with his beautiful etchings. We asked him if he could take a few minutes and explain to us some of the etching process and how he's using his etchings. Bob, what's the first step in making an etching?
Traditionally, this is a piece of copper. It looks silver because it's been electroplated with a steel to protect it once it's done, but basically it's a piece of copper. You coat it with a varnish, and then you scratch with any kind of tool that would make a mark. I use a pin or a razor blade, and you scratch your lines into there, and when you're done, you dip it in an acid, and that acid eats lines into the areas that you've scratched. The longer you leave it in the acid, the deeper the line, and so the deeper the line, the darker. So it's kind of half science, half art. The darker lines become blacker, the grayer lines are only in there for a few seconds. So when you're done, you pull it out and you kind of test each line by how deep you think it is, and you cover over the ones that you don't want to be etched anymore. And you keep repeating that process until you're finished. And then when you're done, you wipe that varnish off, and you're left with just the areas that you've scratched, and that's your printing plate.
That's really quite a few stages to get what you want.
Yeah.
And there's no test printing, is there? I mean, once you think it's finished, then that's pretty much it? Or can you go back in and rework?
It's difficult to go back and rework. You pretty much have to do it and get it right almost the first time. You can make some corrections by smoothing over lines or taking a Dremel tool and burnishing them out, but it never is just right. It's kind of one of those better get it right the first time.
I see your lines are very fine and you have lots of them. I guess that might be why you make such a nice crisp print. Can I hold this?
Yes, you bet.
Now this lasts indefinitely, right?
Well, I get it. The limited edition idea came from etchings. Etchings go back to the 1400s, and as you ink that plate, the ink has a mild carbon base to it, and so it's an abrasive, and as you rub that ink each time you print it, you're wearing it down. And so the whole idea of that the first prints are crisper, later on they become more worn down, is the idea of how limited editions came out. So you only get so many until the plate's completely worn out.
Well, that's interesting. So you really do have a limited edition when you're making etchings. There's just so long this is going to last.
Well, the one step that I did, a lot of artists do, is you can get it electroplated with like 1/1000th millimeter of a steel, and this way you don't have scratches and it doesn't wear down.
I know that you said you put the ink on here and put it through the press. How exactly does that work?
Okay, what you do is you mix up an ink that's an oil-based ink, and you rub it into there, and then, like I was saying, you wipe out the lights and you leave it extra heavy in the darks, and when you get it just the way you want, you lay it down on the press here. You pick up the blankets, you put it underneath.
What is this, felt?
This is felt, and there's several different ones that kind of dissipate the pressure of the press. Oh. So you put that down, lay on a piece of paper, and then run it through the press. Mm-hmm. You pull that wheel, and it squeezes that ink onto the paper. And the other thing is they're considered originals because each time you ink it, you have to ink it every single time that you run it through the press. And as you do that, you're basically painting the plate. And so as you wipe the ink on there, you can wipe out highlights, you can add darks, you can basically create where each one is unique to the next one. So
no two would be the same. You couldn't even make two the same if you wanted to.
You can get pretty close, but if you actually had them next to each other, they wouldn't look the same. The way you can tell a real etching from, say, a fake etching or a print is that when you run your fingers across the surface of an etching, they're raised, kind of like the numbers on a credit card. You can actually feel them in your fingers.
I see. I'll remember that.
So that's how you can tell an etching that's actually been hand printed.
Because the ink's going to stick up just a little bit,
yeah.
So you would be able to feel it.
Yep.
Quite a bit.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll have to go home and touch some of Roger's old etchings and make sure I understand that.
Yeah.
At one time I had my own etching press and did a number of etchings, but really nothing compares to Bob Coronato's etchings. His etchings are the best, I think, that I've ever seen. The process of making etchings is very technical, it's very time-consuming, it's very exacting, and it leaves very little room to make any mistakes. Now, when we were in Bob's gallery, I noticed an antique saloon lantern that caught my attention. We have one here, and that's what I'm going to be painting today. I'll be using acrylics, and on my palette I have titanium white, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, burnt umber, chromium oxide green, cadmium yellow light, ultramarine blue, cerulean blue, and alizarin crimson. Now I chose this palette simply by looking at this lantern here and trying to see what colors I could perceive in here. But basically I'll be using these three earth colors. When I'm using acrylics, I have an atomizer, a very important part of my painting process, and I want to spray some water on that board just so my paint slides over this area a little easier. Well, I think I'll start out by mixing a background color with cerulean blue and yellow ochre, and I'll just cut around this quite loosely. Now, I want my background color to be fairly solid. There's a lot of texture in here, and I don't want too much of the background to fight with the texture that goes on inside the lantern. Now, since this is glass, I'm going to paint right over the chimney of the lantern right here. I don't always have to mix all this paint right on my palette. I can just pick up the colors here and just mix them right on my board. Now, the pencil lines are dark enough where they're showing through, so I'm not going to lose my drawing. This is a masonite board, 11 by 14 inch masonite board. And of course it's primed with a coat of gesso. I find myself using this color for a background quite often. I just kind of like this color. Now the lantern is sitting on a base right now, but I'm going to eliminate the base and we'll maybe pretend like that lantern is hanging from the ceiling or somewhere. Okay, that's covered, but I'm going to put some more paint on there just so I'm assured that it's going to cover and that I lose most of this texture on here. I'm just going over this with it's not a very large brush, but I'm using some big, bold strokes in order to mix this. I'm not dabbing it and working it to death. There, I think that's giving me quite a flat coat of paint on here. I have some texture going on in here, and I like that. I don't want it totally flat. I do want to see my brushworks and a little bit of strokes and variation there, but not a great deal. Well, I think I'll start with my dark colors now on the lantern. And right down here towards the bottom of the lantern, this tends to be very dark right in here. Often colors that I put on my board here are just perceived colors. Sometimes their colors are so dark or so gray, it's really hard to tell what color they are. Of course, brass is a warm color. So I'm using this warmish color back here with the burnt sienna, burnt umber. I think I'll take a bit of alizarin crimson and put right back here as well. I'm going to lay these colors on rather thin to start with, for a couple of reasons. One, I can still see my pencil lines through these thinner paints, and also I like to be able to build up areas of my painting from thin areas to thicker areas. I'm not using any white yet on this board. I'm just using all my colors. I can add some white later, but starting out with my darks and putting my lights over that is generally the way I like to paint. Now I've got some nice highlights going on from that light there, but between the highlights and all, it's quite dark. So that's why I want to make this dark first. And I want to make it dark enough so I can leave room where those highlights are going to show up. Now I had to stage this lantern to get the lighting on it that I wanted. So here's what I did. I have a light down here on this light stand, and I have a nice studio light right here pointing right down into the lantern itself. Lighting still lifes is always a bit of a problem, and it's just, for me, it's a matter of trial and error for the most part. Right down here, there's not much light catching this at all. This would be very dark with my ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Just trying to block in all the areas first and get something covered on my canvas here or on my masonite board. Now with pure yellow ochre right under this lantern here, I'm getting some nice light areas because the light is bouncing down from the light above and bouncing up into this reflector. And this paint is rather thin right now. Over this side it seems darker, so I'll put some of the burnt umber in there. The shade on this lantern is bent, which gives it some character. I like that. And I'll smooth this so I don't see many of my brush strokes. Just drag that with sort of a soft touch of my brush there. In this area of the lantern right here seems very gray. So I'll take my ultramarine blue, burnt umber, that makes a gray color. And with a thin wash, I'll drop that in there. Well, I always like to get every part of my painting covered before I start to refine areas. So the last area to cover here is the top of the lantern shade. So I'll take my ultramarine blue, maybe some cerulean blue, some brown, cut right down into there. Yellow ochre, going to pick up a touch of this cadmium yellow. Right now I'm treating this painting as if it were a watercolor, almost. I'm just applying this paint quite thin. And as I go along, I will just build up the layers of paint so it's a little bit thicker on each application. I know this is a kerosene lantern, but I'm going to add a candle in here just for a touch of color. Why not? And with my alizarin crimson and cerulean blue, I'll make this candle a red candle. Now I'll begin to concentrate on some of these details in the lantern. And this is where I start to use my white. I'll use my spray bottle now, and I'll just mist that lightly. This will get this area damp, and that way when I put this next layer on here, this paint will flow over this other paint very easy. See, this paint here is dry already. There's some very hard light hitting this area right here. Now when using acrylics, I sometimes have to wait for this to dry only a minute or two, but then I have to go back over it because acrylics do not cover as well as oil paints do. I often have to go back and give these acrylics a second pass. There are a number of rings going around all these areas here, so I'll make this darker. I'm picking up a brand new brush. This is a pointed brush. It's never been used before, so it has a nice point on it. And when I make these ellipses around areas like this, I want to be sure that this ellipse feels like it's going around the other side. I don't want it to feel like it goes from here and just stops at the end. On this ellipse, I want to feel like it's going around the back side and around the front again. So when I make this stroke, I start back here I come here, then I lay my brush down, I go around, I come over to this side, and as I go back here, I lift my brush, but I continue that ellipse around to the back side. Here again, I start on the back side, put my brush down, around, and then lift it up as I start the ellipse back on this side. So I want to feel like I've got this continuous ellipse here, and then it doesn't just start here and stop there. Here again, I'll go around this side, I'll come around back, and flip it back this way. But as I flip it back, I pick up the brush. So I'm not actually putting paint back there, but I'm getting that nice oval. There's a lot of reflected light happening in this lantern. This is really a matter of trying to observe as closely as I can what's happening there. There's a lot of pattern work in this lantern, right down in these areas. So there'll be a lot of texture going on there. And I haven't begun to work on that yet. I'm trying to get what's basically all the local colors here and in place. Right under here, it's very, very dark. Ultramarine blue and burnt umber, that'll give me a dark. Now I haven't used any black on my palette. I could have used black here or Payne's gray. It wouldn't have been a bad choice. But I think I can do this painting without using any of those colors. I prefer to use actual colors to make my darks rather than using a black or a Payne's gray. I'm not saying that I never use those, but here I want to put as much color and life in the painting as I can. And I think if I put in those blacks or Payne's grays, I'll just sort of be defeating my purpose here of trying to add as much color as I can to this piece. Okay, right up here, I'm going to take my white and cadmium yellow light, and that's dry, so spray it again. I don't want to spray it very much because I don't want to get this very wet. And here's another tip. If you're using an atomizer like this and you want very fine drops, squeeze the atomizer kind of hard. If you squeeze it lightly, you'll get just big drops. So I can always control the amount of water and the size of the drops on there by the pressure I put on that sprayer. Now I'm not making this pure white or pure yellow because there are some highlights on there, and I want to reserve those bright colors and whites for the highlights. And that'll probably be one of the last things we put on here. Another nice thing about working with acrylics is this is all dry here, so I'm able to put my hand on here and not have to use a ruler or maul stick to steady my hand. And since there is so much detail here and the paint dries, I can put detail in without it mixing with the other paints, which would not be the case if I were using oils. So there's advantages and disadvantages always in using mediums like acrylics versus oils. With my alizarin crimson and yellow, I'll just put a highlight right on this candle. Add a touch of white to that. What looks like a drip of wax. Okay, let's continue to move on down the lantern here. I'm using my small pointed brush, making this dark color. Right here there's a knob that would raise the wick. And on the top with white and yellow ochre, I'll add that highlight. This band in the middle seems to be oxidized. I don't think it's of the same material. So it is sort of a chalky looking color. So I'm going to eliminate some of this warm color here because I don't think that's made out of brass. With my cerulean blue, burnt sienna, and I think I'll take some of my yellow ochre too. I'm trying to figure out the colors right here. We've got some dark patterns there made by that embossing. It's going to be hard to replicate all that pattern. So I'm just going to suggest it. It seems like we have some little round areas here towards the center. Now I'm not painting all the detail that I see up here in this pattern, but I don't think that's really necessary for me to do that. I think what I need to do here is suggest these patterns, and I think that will work out probably fine for what I want to accomplish here. Right in here, there's quite an elaborate pattern of scroll work. I'm kind of getting the impression of what these patterns are. Over here on this side, they almost disappear, but I will put an indication of some of this scroll work on this dark side. And as long as I have my dark colors out with my burnt umber and ultramarine blue, there are these holes in the bottom here. I'll put those holes in there. Okay, now let's put on the highlights. I'll use titanium white, cadmium yellow light. I think I'll spray my board. And with my pure white, I'll add some highlights on the top here because this part of the picture is getting hit with light from above. So this is very white up here. Down here it's very yellow. This is a yellowish light down here on my right. The one up above is a kind of a cool light. There's a very bright highlight coming across the top of this band and around the back, across the front. And I'll pick that highlight up on the other side here, coming around this way. Most of my paintings are really based on big shapes and big areas. And although we did start with the big shape and we blocked in things, this is one of the, I think one of the exceptions where most of the painting is about the small details. White and cerulean blue. Just want to add a few more bright highlights down here. This area right here is catching the light from down below. So I'll put some of that yellow on there, wipe my brush off, and I'll kind of blend this into the joining area. Here are a few more strong highlights where they work their way down the side of the lantern. All right, now I'm going to jump up and work on the chimney here. Since I've already painted the background in here, it won't be too much work just to make this look a bit more like glass with a few highlights. I don't want to overdo these reflections, but some of these reflections look cool and some of them look warm because of the different temperatures of these lights here. Right down at the bottom of this globe is a bit dusty, so the dust inside the globe is catching the light in a beautiful sort of way. And this highlight goes right up under the globe. Now when I look at this lantern, I don't necessarily have to follow every detail that I'm looking at here. What I want to do is get the best looking painting that I'm capable of, and if that means changing these reflections, then that's what I'm going to do. There are a couple of very bright highlights right inside that lantern, but I can't get them very much brighter because I can't get much lighter than what I have here. Now the only alternative to that would be to make this whole area darker, including the background, but I don't think I want to do that. So I'll just have to sacrifice a little bit, and I'll just have to make this light here as light as I can, knowing that as I look at it in real life, it is much brighter. And with my pure yellow, let's put a flame in here. I'm using thick paint on this flame, and I'll add a touch of white to that, and maybe a touch of red at the very bottom of the flame. Now what I can do is make a darker color. I'll have this thin, and I can put a bit of a darker wash back in here, so I just not only have highlights for reflections, I have some dark areas and make this look even more like some glass. I'll just move up the chimney here. Here we have that oval, and of course we can see both sides of that oval up here. Kind of a thin wash down here to make some contrast between the background and the globe. That difference in value there will distinguish the chimney from the background. And with yellow ochre and white, or maybe some yellow, touch on a few more highlights. There's a pattern on this shade, and again this lantern has so many patterns it's slightly hard to deal with. but I'm going to just suggest them. So I'm mixing up a color that's slightly darker than this here. And this pattern does a sort of a crisscross. Not too hard actually when I think about it and simplify it. And I'll give a slight indication of that crisscross pattern this way. And I'm using a flat brush here with this nice chisel edge. With my cadmium yellow light, I'm going to put a nice bright yellow right under here. That might give just a little more indication up here that there's a glow from this candle. This pattern continues itself on the underside of this lantern, but I don't want that to show up very much at all. Well, to finish this piece, I need to put on this wire that holds the shade. With my small pointed brush, I'll mix up a dark color. I want to load my brush up, and I twirl my brush to get myself a point on the end of the brush. And I'll start on this side. And just bring this down. And I can still barely see my pencil line on there. And my background, of course, is dry. So just drag that down. It goes here. I started on this side because I don't want to get my hand. If I were to start on this side and I moved over here, I might get my hand in this. So that's why I started on this side first. And I'll check my hand just to be sure I don't have any paint on it. It's always a good idea. And then I'll just drag this down. Just barely see that pencil line. Well, I think that's going to finish this painting. I could go on further with more detail and more refinement. I'm going to leave it the way it is. It'll make a nice souvenir of our visit to Bob Coronato's gallery in Hulett, Wyoming.
For more information about painting and travel with Roger and Sarah Bansemer, visit paintingandtravel.com.